Okay, and 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you are live.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Reclaiming Paganism from Horror. This is a Glasgow 2024 original event, and we're very pleased to have you all here tonight with our wonderful panelists, so I hope you can all see on your screens as clearly as I can. I'll introduce them in a minute, but before we get started, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So if you have any questions throughout, if you're in the webinar, please put them in the Q&A chat function. If you're on YouTube or you're watching this on YouTube, can you add your questions into the comment section and they will be relayed into our Q&A session and forwarded to us. We will try and answer as many as we can as we go along. If not, we'll answer more at the end and we'll try and make it as interactive as possible. If you're live tweeting tonight, please use the hashtag Glasgow 2024 and then we can pick things up and can also retweet them out too. We do have a code of conduct, which we'd like everyone to be, and we know you're all lovely and nice and polite, but, we have a zero tolerance policy on racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, etc. So if we do catch anyone behaving inappropriately, we will be removing you. So it's one strike and you're out. But other than that, I hope you really enjoy the session and listening to our wonderful guests who are here with me tonight. And I am now going to go round and get them to introduce themselves to you, starting with Mark.
Right, thanks, John. So, hello, hi everybody. I am oddly joining you from Australia. Actually, I'm in Sydney. I originally come from Edinburgh, so it's strange you had to go around the other side of the world to find someone from Scotland, but there you go. So I am, what am I? I'm various interesting things when it comes to this particular topic. I've written a whole bunch of books on various kind of odd, interesting subjects, like Halloween in particular. It's sort of pagan origins from thousands of years ago through to what we do nowadays around the world, trick-or-treating and so on. I have also written about Roslin Chapel, which is a strange medieval place, but has all sorts of weird and wonderful things about it as well. And I have also was one of the producers of the Beltane Fire Festival in Edinburgh and founder of the Samhuinn Festival at Halloween there too. And in my spare time, I also write horror stories and things. Horror stories too. So I have one foot in both of the camps here. So interesting. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Sarah.
Hi, my name is Sarah Johnson. I am, for full disclosure, I am part of the promotions team for Glasgow 2024, doing the Glasgow Presents and in support of John this evening.
I am also here, I promise.
No, not at all. Not at all. I am also pagan. I also work for a company called Sweet Venues, and we host the Brighton Horror Fest every year. I live in Brighton. Oddly, I'm an Australian living in Brighton in England. So, Mark and I just swapped. And he's an old pal of mine. He's an old pal of mine as well. So it's lovely to be in a panel with him. And also lovely to meet Gemma and to learn more about Gemma as we go on. And so, yes, I have an interest in all these things and perhaps a biased member of the team when it comes to paganism.
We'll get more into that shortly. Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, Gemma, please tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're here.
I'm Gemma Amor. I am neither Australian nor Scottish, so I apologise in advance. I am a horror author. I'm a Bram Stoker Award nominated horror author, which people keep telling me I need to mention for these things.
Yeah, it's a good thing to do, I think.
But I guess I prefer to call myself like a genre fiction writer because I don't just stay within horror, although predominantly that has been my bag to date. Interestingly, in relation to kind of, I guess, my qualifications for this panel, I was just saying before we came live, I'm quite, I suppose, agnostic in persuasion. I am really interested in paganism and witchcraft and, the occult and various different things. And I was one of those people that probably we class as the bad guy in terms of this panel, and I wrote a folk horror novel a couple of years ago
Hmm.
where paganism featured quite heavily, but I'm not sure if it counts if it's like interdimensional paganism. So just like go easy on me.
That sounds like a question we should open up to the floor shortly. I'll come back to that. Thank you very much. Okay, so before we kick off, I've just actually realised I should read out the topic of tonight to make sure the audience knows. I hope you're in the right panel. So this is about how themes and topics prevalent within the horror genre, we believe maybe they quickly show a bias towards using real-world faiths and practices that are not Christian as a quick analogue for evil and bad. So we're here to examine these phenomena and seek to determine what, if anything, pagans and people of these faiths can do to counteract this bias. So I think, first of all, can we actually define what paganism is for our audience? And I might pick on someone, but I'm happy for someone to put their hand up and go first.
I think you're pointing at me, Mark, aren't you?
Depends which direction you have no idea.
So from my point of view, I came to paganism in the early 1990s via a bulletin board of all things. And I was living with a then partner in the lovely Blue Mountains in the west of, sort of west of Sydney in Australia. And I'd been questioning things a lot, and I'd not so recently left the Christian church, but I was casting around for meaning and something that made sense of my spiritual leanings. And paganism for me initially was about potions and love spells and, you know, the cottage witch and that kind of thing. And then I very quickly, over a very short period of time, came to learn that it meant paganism paganism is a vast umbrella term that covers a whole range of beliefs and practices, some of which have developed into more separate practices these days. For example, heathenism didn't exist as it does today. And certainly I had the only kind of understandings of things like the Egyptian pantheon or the Greek pantheon or even the Roman pantheon I knew about from history. But paganism essentially covers a vast swathe of beliefs that are not any of the main Abrahamic faiths or any of the main Eastern faiths either. Sorry, that was a bit rambly.
No, that was really, really good. Would we agree with
any
that?
description of what paganism is tends to be a bit rambly, to be honest, because there's so many kind of weird caveats and it is so eclectic.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you're trying to simplify it, which is always risky, I would also, it's, you know, possibly the worship of old gods and old goddesses. It's probably a nice way to put it. But it's not always worship as well.
No.
You know, like, a lot of people would not necessarily say that they worship all of the, you know, any particular gods or goddesses, but they have essentially a reverence for nature, I would say, and for the this planet that we live on, that sustains us and looks after us, rather than maybe the idea of a creator of this planet in that way. So it's, you know, it's often very closely connected with people's having very deep kind of ecological beliefs as well. And I need to step away from sort of modern life, technology, cities, and reconnect themselves with dirt and grass under their feet and woods that walk around in, and, you know, lighting fires at night and sitting under the stars. Is, you know, these are very important parts of that thing of us being part of the natural world rather than maybe this sort of artificial world that we've created.
It actually sounds quite relaxing when you describe it in that way.
Very chilled until you get to human sacrifice. It's, you know, it's all
okay.
Summer is coming in.
I'm only kidding.
I was I was going to ask as well, from my point of view, as somebody that doesn't really know much about paganism at all, I very recently went to the lovely remote Boscastle in Cornwall, which, if nobody has been, has got an absolutely incredible museum dedicated to witchcraft and paganism, called the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, which is well worth the price of entry. You have to book a ticket before you go, but it's a fascinating place. And for me, wandering around expecting witches on broomsticks with hats and cats, and there is a fair amount of that, there was also a lot of talk of paganism and rituals and different, I guess, deities like Baphomet, the goat-headed horned god, and various other different kind of, I guess, icons. And one of the things that stood out for me about, I suppose, if it falls under the umbrella of paganism, which again, I don't really know if it does, was what Mark was saying is the idea of, I guess, it seems to be more practice based, if that makes sense, rather than religious. It's like rituals and practices, and which a lot of spiritualism is, I suppose, when you think of things like manifestation, that the idea of kind of carrying out private personal rituals as a way of engaging with the natural world or with these other belief systems, if that makes sense at all. That really stood out to me. It's a fascinating museum. It's really, really worth making the trip if you can get down there.
I've just popped it in the chat for everyone to, have a look at as well. That's a really good recommendation. Thank you. Yeah,
I would say it's probably, they're a set of very participatory kind of faiths and religions and things, more than people that I grew up with the Church of Scotland, which is probably about as pagan as a Christian church can get. But you still, on a Sunday morning, you're going to church, sit in your pew, and you've got the person at the front who's everybody sings, though. That's good. There's all singing. We had weird things like harvest festivals and all sorts of strange and interesting things.
I remember those.
Really seem to fit oddly with
So I used to, in one of my past lives and past jobs, I used to work for English Heritage years ago, like 10, 15 years ago. And part of that meant that I was lucky enough for a couple of years in a row to steward at the summer solstice at Stonehenge. And part of my job description was confiscating rather homemade druidic ceremonial staffs and spears, and there were some wonderful kind of basically tree trunks with axe heads chopped in the top, and I was like, I'm really sorry, but you can't take that in. But the thing that struck me was the kind of ritual element of like celebrating the solstice, celebrating nature, being outdoors, watching the sunrise. And I know the winter solstice is a big deal, and I was just recently at Avebury where they were celebrating the autumn equinox, and I think the Druid community were appointing a new leader as well, so there were lots of different kind of ceremonial things going on. Awesome. And particularly in the context of that ancient kind of prehistory landscape with the monuments and the stones, it makes you realize how long I suppose paganism has been tied to England as well as a country, or Britain or Britannia or whatever you want to call us.
Albion, we were mentioning earlier.
The pre-Roman, and it goes all the way back to a point where there were no written records. So I suppose you can assume that we still, in those early days, worshipped the sun and water and the woods and the trees and animals and things that made sense to kind of deify, because they were things that affected your everyday life as a human being trying to survive in a kind of inhospitable environment as it would have been back then. So
although one of the things that's fascinating, I think, about when we talk about paganism now is, and Sarah will have lots of this as well, is that in reality it's a very new system. We're actually talking about neo-paganism. So we're talking about a new pagan. This isn't a continual thing which has managed to survive for years. Some people may believe it is out there, but that'd be slightly controversial. But these are things that were very kind of broken and then stitched back together in very creative, imaginative ways that fitted for the times that they reappeared as well. So actually, when we talk about Druids in particular being at Stonehenge at the summer solstice, the guy that kicked that off was actually from Glasgow. And he was, he was a bit of a die-in-the-wool socialist, and he was a bit kind of
I like him already.
A big, chunky, kind of grumpy, sort of two-fisted guy.
I think I met him. I think I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
This was about 1911, 1912, so over 100 years ago. But he created a thing called the Universal Bond, which ended up kind of growing and expanding, and after he died, becoming the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids. And it was him that kind of took what had been kind of Druidic friendship groups, which were already around, which were about supporting workers, and brought the spiritualism, spirit into it, so spirituality rather. And it's him that kind of starts associated with Stonehenge, and they would meet there at the summer solstice because it's warmer than the winter solstice.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah. So it's an odd one, because as much as these things have ancient roots and are inspired by, whether Wiccas and Druidism and the heathen things, so they may be inspired by ancient Norse gods or Egyptian gods or Greek gods or British goddesses, or they are new, and they are a massive 20th century faith, which is the fastest growing faith in the world, as you say, fastest growing religions in the world now, and a very British thing, a lot of it as well, other than the Norse ones that I mentioned. But Wicca in particular and Druidism is a faith that was brought from this, not this country where I am, but from Britain, and has wandered around the rest of the world.
I think to add to that as well, one of the things that I loved about the autumn equinox kind of ceremony that I was watching were the troupe of musicians who were leather-clad bikers with green man masks and drums and kind of old-fashioned instruments, and it was that real clash of like you're saying, like modernism with like, you can imagine a version of this going back thousands of years, and it's so interesting to me that places like Avebury and Stonehenge, there's like more and more evidence as archaeological finds are kind of always happening, that those were meeting places of old, perhaps not ceremonial, maybe mostly trade based. A lot of people think now that people just went there to trade and set up stalls, but I love the idea that still thousands of years later, in some iteration, we're gathering and sharing and performing, I guess, human rituals. Like even trading is a ritual of sorts, isn't it? It's like you exchanging one thing for another, which a lot of religions are based around the exchange of things. So but it did make me chuckle, the kind of massive like leather jackets and studs and huge boots and big bikes, and then like doo-doo on the drums. It
sounds great.
It was good fun. You should, Avebury's always good fun.
I'm gonna go. We've had a couple of questions come in as we've been talking around this, actually, and I think they're quite relevant. So we've got one from the States wondering if our Native American indigenous people would fit into the umbrella of paganism, and one also about Australian Aboriginal beliefs. Do these also fit within this discussion?
Could I perhaps weigh in on that? And I'm going to tread incredibly carefully, because the white history of Australia is awful in many cases, particularly to very much to our native peoples, and I would suggest that both the First Nations in North America and in Australia, the First Nations people in Australia, those spiritual practices do not fall under paganism, because just because it's outside the Abrahamic faiths and or the Eastern faiths that we know of does not make it lesser or fringier or anything else. I think that those the spiritual practices of Australia and Northern America very much stand on their own.
I think
that's answered your questions.
There is an interesting thing though as well, which also happens around cultural appropriation. So there's, again, treading carefully. There is in Wicca, I would say, there has been a cultural appropriation of smudging
Mm.
as something which came from the First Nations tribes in America. If you are buying your sage, what have you, find a source that is actually run by native people, and buy from them, because they are sharing their culture at that point. If you're buying them randomly from something which doesn't have that, then no. But there is definitely a bit of I think probably from the New Age times onwards, and actually with the American Indian stuff, there was a lot of American Indian sort of spirit guides and things when it came to spiritualism and seances in the Victorian era, because they were seen as like noble savages and things. So it has been that those religions have been brought into and kind of appropriated a lot. And so it's it's not a healthy, happy story at that point.
Appropriation is, sorry to cut you over there. I was just thinking appropriation in the context of this panel though is rather apt in that horror particularly doesn't just appropriate paganism, it appropriates native stories, things like the Wendigo, which is used over and over again ad infinitum, and it's often written by people that don't really understand the cultural context of it, which might actually be offensive to First Nation people, or I've actually fallen into that trap myself with a short story that I wrote that featured Wendigo, and it wasn't until I spoke to some friends of mine that I realized how deeply inappropriate that was, because I just came from a background of thinking, oh, that's a cool story, this is a cryptid, and actually I knew none of the kind of subtleties around the history of it. And so I think, although I don't know anything about whether or not it counts under the paganism banner, I do think it's appropriate in the context of when we write horror in particular, and fiction, and I guess sci-fi to a certain extent as well. When we're borrowing these legends and these stories and these things that we don't fully appreciate, what are we doing in terms of perpetuating the appropriation of that? Like, what is appropriation as well is another question, but I don't know, I'm becoming increasingly more educated, I think, as I go through my journey as a writer, and it's definitely one of the things that I'm more sensitive to, which I think is why a lot of the stuff that I write now, where it leans into folk and pagan and cults, I try and make like I say, there's an element of like an alternate reality or another dimension, so that it's not fully rooted in anything here. And I was also particularly aware of, again, visiting the Museum of Witchcraft, there is a heavy air of kind of what I found to be, it was fascinating, and I felt very respectful in that space. Other visitors, not so much. A lot of them found the phallic symbology really amusing, and it was just.
I think the Psy summarizes it quite well.
Right, I'm just becoming more aware as I go through the world that there's a lot about different cultures that I don't understand, and as a writer I think that's really relevant, and I think it's up to me to educate myself a bit better, which I'm trying to do as I go forward, but it does make it a little bit of a minefield sometimes, which is why I end up making everything up these days.
No, I think it's a really good method you've just described. I mean, we can make stuff up, so we don't have to always root it in someone else's beliefs. We can we always draw on what we know. But no, I think that's a very good point. And it leads into a lot of the stuff that we've got in the chat. And a question that I had is paganism treated as a villain in all horror stories where it features? And if so, why? I mean, you probably answered some of this already.
Well, I think if you look at, so one of the examples I think in the notes for this panel was The Wicker Man, which is a fantastic movie rooted in the Isle of Summer, or Summer Isle, and it's a kind of religious practice that is sort of centered on the harvest and abundance and sexuality and fertility and human sacrifice, and they do come across as the bad guys in a way, although I always watch that film and I'm always like, yeah, good on you, because Edward Woodward is always just so stuffy, and I'm like, for God's sake. And it's that clash of Christianity and I suppose paganism, but essentially it's the main protagonist, the hero, is a Christian who is rather ironically, from the perspective of the Christian faith, when you think of the history of them in Romans and all the rest of it, is sacrificed by pagans. So that, I suppose, is, I don't want to use the word demonizing, but it is, you know, setting that religion up as the bad guy.
I think demonizing is a fair word from my studies. And just for full disclosure, I've got a degree in theological studies, and it made me agnostic because I did a lot of Christian theology. So I think demonizing is fine, Gemma, from my perspective, with all due respect to everybody.
I mean, I would quite happily live on that island. Quite. This looks like a great time.
Visit some of the places like Floxton where it's filmed. It's lovely in the summer.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
It's
beautiful. No, I
beautiful.
did a road trip around there a few years ago.
It's lovely places.
In the summer.
Yeah, in the summer. Definitely in the summer.
summer.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. No, but the Wicker Man is, I mean, the Wicker Man, let's just be clear as well. We're talking about the Christopher Lee Wicker Man. We're not
the Nicolas
not the
Cage
Nicolas
one.
Cage one.
Wicker
Which,
Man,
interestingly,
It doesn't exist, does it? I
different
thought it was
kind of
bad.
horror.
it's on Prime at the moment, and the scene that he's kind of vilified for, where he sort of screams "not the bees," has been cut out of the newly released version on Prime, which makes no sense in the context of his death at all, because it shoots away and comes back, and he's all, anyway. It's
that's the only good bit of the film.
It's the only good bit. That's why I was watching it. I wanted to see "not the bees," and they've cut it for some reason. Maybe because he's tired of everybody laughing at him for that scene.
But yeah, the Wicker Man is a beautiful example of exactly what we're looking at here, because Robin Hardy put that together and directed it, and he worked with folk. They did their studies, you know. They went off and they read Margaret Murray, and they read books about druids, and they literally picked all of the juicy, interesting bits that they could find from everywhere. Like, oh, we've got maples, excellent, with naked people dancing around them, and we've got people jumping, and we've got like kids doing this, and outside the pub at night, there's shenanigans happening in the churchyard, and you know. But it's all sort of lifted from, you know, different parts of folklore and what people were doing actually around some of what at that point they thought was, you know, surviving witchcraft and Wicca and things. But what they were mostly looking for is at that point was something that's very different and very British, because they'd been, you know, it was like Dracula movie, another Dracula movie.
All the Hammer horrors,
and they were lifting ghost stories and doing all sorts of interesting things, and you know, maybe a werewolf here and there, but they wanted something that was just different and had that flavor and that sort of uniqueness. And if you look at the time that it came out, it absolutely was, you know, perfect. You had the sort of, you know, Glastonbury's and that sort of return to folk festivals and everything. And it was like, right, well, here's the dark side of that. Let's have a look at that shadow side of it. Which is, you know, for a lot of people, that is a fundamental part of their pagan beliefs as well, is that it's not purely a religion of light, but it's a religion of light and darkness, of spring and summer and autumn and winter. You know, your goddesses are just as likely to be involved with death as they are to do with birth and rebirth. So it's a you know, you get the full package.
Yeah, you do.
And they did give Edward Woodward lots of opportunities to not be a virgin, but he just, you know, refused not to be. He could have, like,
to be fair, he it's not an easy role to play somebody that uptight, and my God, didn't he do well? Like,
super well. Yeah, very impressive.
Also, someone has put in the chat one of the best lines from the original Wicker Man. Of course they jump over the bonfire naked. It's much too dangerous to do it with their clothes on.
Oh, yes. Actually, one of the things that I found really interesting looking back at the horror genre per se is just what we find frightening. And that is essentially what, when people, I think, have been casting around for all of these, you know, the threads of the story, what is it that we find frightening? And actually, this also slightly ties into paganism in that paganism, or the spiritual practices of our ancestors was all about making meaning of the world, and the good and the bad that happens in the world, and just trying to make some sense of how it works. We have no idea how it actually works, but we like to convince ourselves that we have some sense of, some idea of how it all works. And so that which we find frightening has changed and morphed over the years. You know, originally it was vampires and ghosts, and then certainly as the popular culture developed around horror, you know, it became more and more sophisticated, and more fractured. You know, you've got folk horror and psychological horror and slasher horror and body what is that proper term?
Body horror.
Yeah,
Horror,
yeah.
Body horror, yeah.
Yeah, about, you know,
I thought you said buddy horror. I was like, which genre is that? I've missed it.
I like
rocking
that
around
genre.
the clock. Rocking around the clock. That's what we're doing.
That's a Will Ferrell movie.
Oh God, no. That's my sense of horror. Anyway, but yeah, it's just fascinating that, you know, it's the unknown. And I guess if it's not your spiritual practice, if it's not your spiritual belief, and if your spiritual belief, certainly coming from a Western perspective, says that there shall be no other religious or spiritual belief, then that which is other is frightening, potentially.
Can I interject with a Western perspective or a Christian Western perspective?
The latter.
Because I certainly found that interesting, because I see a lot of research on Christians approaching pagans with sort of this, as in it is the other, therefore it is evil, and we don't understand it. And actually someone has just put in the chat, people fear the other, whatever, or whoever it is. So in a dominant Christian culture, pagans fit the bill.
Pretty much.
But then I think it depends on the context as well, because we're talking about horror films. So when we're talking about horror films, you're expecting something scary and horrible and gory and awful to happen. Within the context of that, you know, you've got maybe an hour and a half to tell a story. So if you're going to include paganism and pagans in there, the chances are you're going to have to spend a fair bit of time just explaining, without a whole bunch of boring exposition, who pagans are and what they do. So they might as well be the bad guys, because then you can actually investigate all of that weirdness. And it has all this wonderful spookiness, and it is very visual, and it does have great stories, obviously. And it's, you know, we grew up with the fairy stories of Snow White and the Wicked Witch, and you know, and these, you know, fabulous kind of like evil witches in the woods with their gingerbread houses and so on. So there's something very sort of deeply rooted about that we bring to those you know, stories immediately. But if you look at witches not in horror films, whether it's Bewitched, you know, or it's Willow from Buffy, or Charmed, or there's witches all over the place that are not remotely threatening and are quite happily friendly and integrated into society like nice, sensible people. And
well, Willow did go a bit off the rails in one season, if I recall. But she did come back and became super good.
You're right. It was justified. I'm gonna go with that. It's fine.
Yep.
But there's definitely that. It's not, you know, we think often that that's maybe a new thing, but you know, I Married a Witch was like the 1950s. It's a black and white film. You know, there has for a long time been that kind of undercurrent of witches aren't always the baddies. Bed Knobs and Broomsticks, fantastic film. Angela Lansbury versus the Nazis. You know, this is great, and she's a witch, and she's doing her correspondence course to become a witch. Flies in a broomstick. You know, but when you're talking about horror, you want color and images and fabulous characters, and those are absolutely in the pantheons that people are fascinated in with paganism as well. So it's an opportunity to play with those and play with, you know, the darkness in them often.
I think
Like-
what strikes me as well is that we haven't yet touched on the kind of persecution of witches. And when I think of the horror genre, I always think of witchcraft in the sense of the Crucible as well. So Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which is, I guess, the historic version of Satanic Panic. And it's worth mentioning here, I think, because the number of women and men who were persecuted under the banner of witchcraft.
Yep.
Perhaps because, as we were sort of, to bring it back to what we were saying earlier, they might have behaved in a way that other people didn't understand and were therefore frightened of. So perhaps displayed signs of some sort of mental instability, or living in a way that was kind of unorthodox, or just not really getting along very well with their neighbor, and how that was kind of swept under the banner of witchcraft. And that's a theme that comes out again and again and again in the horror genre, because it's actually quite horrifying to think of the torture and persecution and interrogation of thousands and thousands of women. And Witchfinder General as well, if you're talking about movies, is a really brilliant example of kind of, again, going back to that era of filmmaking, the 60s and 70s, where they was turning away from Hammer and becoming a bit more serious. Another one in that vein, although it's not witchcraft, is Neither the Sand Nor the Sea, I think it's called. And it's about a woman whose boyfriend dies and then comes back, and he's a zombie and she falls in love with him. But it was all very serious and poetic and gritty, and it's sort of, I don't know, I think witchcraft in the context of fear is that the two things are inseparable in our genre, but often the fear isn't directed in the right way. It's like, oh, the witch is scary. Well, actually, no, hang on, the people who persecuted the witches were scarier to me, like, because it just seemed to be licensed for torture and murder on a mass scale.
Absolutely. So. Yeah. I think one of the interesting bits around that is you've touched now on two of the three cornerstones of the folk horror subgenre thing. So Wicker Man and Witchfinder General. So Blood on Satan's Claw is the other one.
Love that film.
Talk about,
love that film.
I
really
dig
good.
a hole with the camera in it and just show you the dirt. And those become cornerstones of that kind of weird Britain that there was in the 70s and 80s. I remember Doctor Who being remarkably strange a lot of the time when we were young, and having some of these sort of folk horror-y type roots as well. And grew up reading The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper, and fabulous books by Alan Gardner and people as well. So it was there, and it was strange, and it was dark, and those are beautiful things to have in any story. Things that are mysterious, and things that are secret, and things that are strange, and things that are dark. If you're telling that with horror, then often that ends quite badly for your protagonist. But not necessarily. And I think the thing that's maybe it's interesting about some of the things that are approaching this now is a change in that perspective as well. So in particular, I'd probably look at Robert Eggers' The Witch, and which he again, very almost like the Wicker Man, he sat there and he said, right, I'm going to look at all the things that witches, inverted commas, were accused of doing, and I'm going to put them all into the film. So, stealing babies and grinding them up to make flying ointments, and black goats were able to talk. Sorry, no spoilers, that's enough. There's a bit of spoilers in this, sorry. A bit of spoilers in this bit. But throughout this, what you've actually got is Anya Taylor-Joy's character going from someone who is being raised in a very fundamental Christian kind of way to being slowly kind of transforming herself into a witch, and being lost in that world and becoming part of that. A woman who lives in the woods and can fly and is cavorting around the bonfire. So she's not, you know, Sergeant Howie being shoved into a wicker man with a bunch of goats and chickens up above him going, and being incinerated. She's becomes part of this, the horrors that she sees. But, you know, but actually there's some real horror there in her family and in the Christianity that she's coming from as well and leaves behind. So that's a very sophisticated look at this. It's just fascinating to see that evolution and changing. But yeah, I mean, the people who were persecuted witches, it was the stories, you know, it was the supernatural witch stories of what they could do and the power that they had, which helped people to be really scared. And then it was an opportunity to persecute people who had very little power. So it was the homeless and often you know, people with mental difficulties, and the other that they could pick on.
The other, yeah. So off the back of that, how can we, as creators of horror and modern pagans, approach all of these issues of using how do we approach them using an ancient religious spiritual practice? How do we respond to them being used as cheap thrills, which it sounds like they are being used as cheap thrills a lot of the time?
Expensive thrills.
Cheap, expensive thrills, yes.
I don't know that I have an answer.
You don't have to have an answer. I'm just throwing it out there.
I think for me as a writer, whether it's to do with religion or a belief system or sexuality or identity or anything where I'm not entirely sure if I'm doing the theme justice. So for me, if I've become aware that something is perhaps being used in or appropriated or not presented fairly or in a good light in a genre way that has become problematic, my first line of defense is to then write something which doesn't do any of those things. So for me personally, that then means I go through a thought process of, right, how can I not be that person? So generally that boils down to, for me, for the first step, a sensitivity reader. It is a lifesaver in the sense of, if I don't really understand what I'm writing about, somebody else will. And the wonderful thing about social media is I could generally ask somebody. Let's say I had a trans protagonist in one of my novels, I would probably ask a trans friend to sensitivity read that content for me so that it's not highly problematic or it doesn't lean on any old-fashioned harmful tropes, or, you know, and the same goes for, I suspect, paganism. I think one active way of combating the kind of misuse of somebody else's belief system is to make sure that you're aware of that possibility and then take active steps to mitigate it. So yeah, I think that would be my first step. And again, I don't know whether working in elements of fantasy or kind of things that aren't grounded, like I said before, in this world, whether that makes it any better or any worse, I don't know, but that for me makes me feel slightly more comfortable about the content that I'm writing, because as Mark was saying, a lot of the imagery is incredibly evocative. I like to think of things like Green Man, you know, which crops up in my work quite a lot, just the idea of this kind of natural deity. I don't want to do disrespect, but I love the imagery, and that fires off my nerve centers as a writer. So, and I'd love to lean into that, and I get inspired by history and culture all the time. But in the course of being inspired by, you can often not, like I said before, fully understand the context of what it is you're writing. So that's my 2 cents. I think the first line of combat for me is understanding that it's an issue and then seeking out some sort of expert source to help me avoid that pitfall going forward.
Yeah.
As someone has just written in the webinar chat, could we please destroy the trope that paganism equals Satanism and feck yes. I remember many back to the 90s, there was some radio program and they were talking about witches and they were talking about intercourse with goats, and it was just like, oh really, please. It was old then, it's very, very old now, please just stop.
Well, actually, Sarah, off the back of that, we've
Yep.
had a parallel question in the Q&A. It's more of an observation,
Yep.
wondering if at least some of the use of paganism is an easy shorthand, is still rooted in a fear of sex, and especially female sexuality. How do we feel
Yes.
about that?
Is it a fear, or is it just an opportunity to put it on screen?
No, it's fear.
Well,
It's definitely fear-based.
Yeah.
So what you were saying about
Yeah.
the witch is a really good example of how actually Anya Taylor-Joy's character is basically Edward Woodward. She's still a virgin, and her latent sexuality, it kind of morphs into this powerful thing, and she goes from this virginal state to this like, well, hang on, I've just suddenly become a woman, and it's all tied up with kind of puberty and periods, and it's like there is an inherent fear of women's sexuality that runs throughout. And if a woman,
yeah,
right, and if a woman was promiscuous back in the medieval era, she was probably labeled a witch. You know, there is always a fear. I get really, really like fired up about this. Like, there is a huge amount of fear associated with a woman being in control of her own sexuality, her own fertility, her own bodily autonomy, her own self in so many ways. And a lot of the labels like witchcraft are there as a form of control in that sense. So
I'd agree, and it kind of parallels again the question/observation is paralleling more looking at the situation in the US at the moment. That's still very much a topic of contention in their world and elsewhere. Yeah, that's an excellent observation from our very, very observant audience. Okay.
I was going to actually just add a quick thing about in terms of how pagans and how folk can tackle, the image of paganism within horror, I suppose. And it does actually happen. It doesn't happen very often, but if you look at The Craft, for example, there are good witches in that as well as bad witches. It's actually it's not that the Christians step in and rescue people at the end. So there is that kind of going on there. It happens a lot in sort of the supernatural TV things more than anything else. A nice example though is if any of you have seen a movie. Speaking of Nicolas Cage, as we were going serious Nicolas Cage on you, Color Out of Space, which is a Lovecraftian film. The daughter is a pagan in there, and she is using her witchcraft. She's using her paganism to try and stop what's happening to her family. And much like the Christians in the Omen, it's not going to work. It's this thing is so kind of out there, powerful, and dimensional and just alien to everything that we have, that it's not going to her paganism, her power from there isn't enough to stop it either. But at that point, she's that's seeing that in a positive light within there.
No, I agree.
It can happen.
Yeah.
You've got to write it in there.
Agreed. Are Christians always the heroes?
No, definitely not.
Can you give me some examples, Mark? You sound like you've got a stack ready.
Well, Witchfinder General is a great example. There's a really probably mostly forgotten Lance Henriksen film called The Pit and the Pendulum.
I love that film.
It's a great film. Which has people being accused of being witches and stuff as well, and what have you, and Spanish, so Inquisition-y type things and stuff. And there's a lot of not a lot, but there's a few where most definitely the Christians are most definitely not the goodies when it comes up against the witches.
Well, Christianity is often demonized in horror movies as well, just in a different way. Things like, I suppose The Exorcist isn't a great example, but it does go to show some sort of, I don't know, that's probably not the best example, but there are definitely movies and books where I suppose fundamental Christianity or Christianity as a practice is presented in a bad way. And I think one thing that I'm always cognizant of is that with any religion or any organized religion, although I don't personally agree with the concept of an organized religion in that sense, many people get an awful lot of comfort and joy and many positive things out of their various faith systems. So it's really easy to say, oh, you know, this is being demonized by this group, but it also happens the other way. And I think for me I try and be as, I guess, tolerant as possible of whatever anybody else wants to believe in. That's completely their thing. But
their choice.
I think Christianity often gets maligned as well, because it's the easy choice, right? There's a lot of things there that are easy to pick on, particularly in the horror genre. So
well, you've got a couple of thousand years worth of history that you can pick on anything for. Look, Crusades, well, you're bad people, you know, like wasn't really us, you know, that's quite a while ago. But I think horror will also cherry pick things that are available, different,
and zeitgeisty as well, whatever's zeitgeisty at the time.
I mean, I hate to mention the fact that there's a Winnie the Pooh horror film coming out.
I saw the trailer.
Awesome.
It does. It looks amazing.
It looks so good. I am so down for it.
I'm gonna have to hunt for this.
It's like proper. It's gone proper splatterpunk, like Winnie the Pooh. It's not. This is not Oz anymore, Toto. It's,
it's your fault. Yeah, if you've got a copyright, you're just in trouble. It's as simple as that. Yeah.
It just makes me wonder if there's a whole world of like lapsed IP horror from my childhood, like Rupert the Bear, or like all these things that are going to come out now. I can't wait.
Actually, someone in the webinar chat has to speak to this. I found it interesting that Stephen King's inspiration for Carrie was from visiting a house where a mother had a giant Christian cross in her living room. And the imagery from the core belief mythology, if I may use that phrase, of Christianity are terrifying.
You know, King uses that a lot in his stuff. I think most notably with The Mist, the short story The Mist, with the very Christian lady who talks about expiation when they're kind of all trapped in the shop together, and it comes up in his books over and over and over again, that kind of Christianity in not being a positive addition to the community. Which I suppose is when you touch a personal nerve as a writer, you do have recurring themes in your work. But
no, I'd agree. And actually, there's a question that's also popped up related to this in the Q&A. Do you think writers resort to the Christian/pagan dichotomy because it's something most readers will easily understand? Whereas if they use something else, it might be lost on the readers. Is it just being lazy or being uninformed, or both?
I don't think it's lazy for me. I just think, like Mark was saying, like all of these religions have been around for such a long time. They're a part of our day-to-day life and our culture. So it makes sense that we would want to view our lives through the lens of whatever we're writing. I think, again, sexuality is used and has been used for many, many hundreds and thousands, not thousands of years. That's silly. You know what I mean? Like you could say that about any facet of how we live as humans. I think, just from my point of view, it's just that Christianity's got legs. So why not write about it? Like,
well,
I hasten not to call any. I was going to say, I hasten not to call any writer lazy, because it's bloody hard work. As well.
Agreed.
There's a difference to, I don't know, the quality of ideas, or what you're asked to write, and sometimes what you're asked to change, or people's beliefs, come out in these things as well. But you could, the thing with it as well is it's beautifully rich. It touches a nerve with us that from very much from our childhoods onwards. And you can do completely and utterly different things with it as well. So one minute you can have Thor running around in Thor Ragnarok, and that he's a Norse god. These are he's a Norse god. This is part of a heathen religion that's resurging massively across Scandinavia at the moment. But you can also do like the Northman, where Robert Eggers, from The Witch,
Mm.
and then does the Northman, and he has Viking paganism in there. He's got Bjork sort of in this very sort of weird, dark, kind of supernatural elements of this, and beautiful work. It doesn't go full horror, but it's a giant medieval action movie, effectively. But there's definitely the religion is in there, this sort of weirdness of it, and the sinister nature of some of that is beautifully done.
Do we think we can give some more examples? Because this is something that I became a bit frustrated with, because when I thought about it, I could think of some good examples of horror novels, books in particular, and Gemma, I might call on you for this one, films, TV shows, and games that don't use pagans as the villain. In fact, quite the opposite. And have we got some good examples we can share with the audience?
Well, I think start with Eggers, because his body of work, to be honest with you, spans not just the folk horror genre, but largely. Was A Field in England his as well? I think it was.
No,
wasn't
that's
it?
Ben Wheatley.
No, that's Weekly. Weekly again is another one, and that's a fantastic example of kind of. Well, actually, I don't know what it is an example of, because it's such an odd film. But
that one down.
I am struggling to think off the top of my head without doing more research of anything that fits into that catery, honestly. And that's probably says something in itself.
No,
I'd say it's not vast. It's certainly not remotely anywhere near. I mean, just think about how many mentioned Dracula, dozens and dozens of it, isn't it? It's the most filmed horror character ever. Compared to that, it's quite niche. But the folk horror revival, which is happening, is is fascinating, and a brilliant thing to sort of be part of, and to see kind of evolving right now. And again, I think it comes a bit from this thing of, well, it's the people who grew up with the sort of weird 70s and weird 80s, getting to a point of being old sort of Gandalf looking people like me that can do more stuff.
I grew up in the 80s,
and creating more things ourselves. But it's also that we work with laptops. We're sitting on a laptop right now. I'm sitting on a laptop talking to you, and I spend my entire day working on a laptop because I'm working from home doing digital things. That needs to be away from that. That needs to disconnect yourself from the modern. And go and find the ancient, go and find the wild, go and find these things, is seductive, but also can be terrifying for people. I think that's why this sort of folk horror thing has kind of crept out. It is often people off in the woods, so like The Ritual.
I was gonna shout Adam Neville out, actually, because his recent The Reddening as well, which is very Cornwall based kind of folklore horror. They are often the bad guys in his books, but he writes it with nuance, and I like that. The Ritual is a very good example of a very complex, I guess, made up pagan religion, or whatever you want to call it, where it's not rooted in reality, but it's influenced by things. And there are characters in there who are both good-ish and just serving the god. And they're not presented as good versus evil in that sense. They are literally just there to pay their dues to the god that they believe in. So they don't consider themselves to be bad as well, which is the other thing. I think perspective when it comes to that kind of thing is really important. So the other one in that vein, which we didn't get to, was Hereditary. And to those people, and the power of that movie to me as well is that to those people kind of summoning their god or resurrecting their god or demon, they don't see that as a bad thing. They see that as a revelatory thing. They see that as a powerful thing. They see that they're just doing their duties. Which I suppose you can say of anybody in a religious context. So I think this idea of like good versus bad with paganism in horror is a lot more complex perhaps than we can discuss on the surface of it, if that makes sense.
No,
because it doesn't take into consideration the motivations of a protagonist in a particular book or movie. If that isn't really annoying response.
No,
It's certainly becoming a lot more nuanced.
Yeah.
I don't think like, a lot of horror films weren't necessarily terribly nuanced in the 70s and 80s, especially the 80s.
I think there's some now that you could say are not
But now,
terribly nuanced.
yeah, you can absolutely. Midsummer, is again, Ari Aster is, he's created his own. He's got a lot of, very rooted in, the imagery of Druidism and witchcraft and everything else, but it's its own thing, frankly.
I was going to ask you about that in the context of folk horror, because I think it sits there.
It does. I think it sits there for me, but I think where people struggle with it is, again, the people in that community don't see that they're doing anything wrong. They have a very distinct natural order of things. So the scene that always comes to mind in that context is the elderly couple who have reached the end of their life cycle, and there is a ceremony where they, hop off of a cliff and then get roundly battered with a huge mallet just to finish the deal. And it's horrifying, but it's only horrifying in a Western context where, like, when you get old here, you go into a care home and then you die and then you get buried. It's like a very different system. And like, actually, again, that ties back into, we're just scared of what we don't know, right? That's all it is. And that's why it's so effective, because I don't actually think they don't see themselves as the bad guys. It does sort of veer into that territory a bit towards the end, when there's like hands sticking out of the ground and guys with his eyes sewn open and lungs as wings and all the rest of it.
They've got a few issues, I think.
But maybe they're just being like, maybe that's just artistic creativity, who knows? It's like, we do different hairstyles, why not different corpse styles? But it's like, I think the reason that's so effective is because you can't actually say either way, these are big scary people. They're quite nice, friendly, mouth clicky, hand clappy, let's drink this period blood cocktail. Like they're just going about what they see as, that was a giggle. They're just going about what they see as their kind of everyday business, and they've been doing it that way for many hundreds of years. And I love that. I love how clever that is. That you can play into the fear of the unknown in that sense, like you see it as a traveler, as a foreigner. And that's why it's so perfect to me that the main protagonist at the end, all she spent the whole movie doing is looking. Danny has been looking for a family because she's lost hers. Her boyfriend is a piece of shit and thoroughly deserved everything he got. Spoilers, and by the end, she finds this family who take her in, and she's actually smiling and she's happy. And I love that. It's like the happiest ending in any horror movie ever.
It's off her face at the time. There's a slightly hysterical level of smiling as well. But
it's so well done.
Again, it's about woman coming into power.
Right,
and
it's
that's
exactly
scary
it.
For some reason.
Exactly it. She was abused horribly in that situation throughout her life, probably also abused a little bit by the family situation she was in before. And then finally she becomes May Queen. She reclaims all of that like natural kind of energy for herself, and she's having a nice time, like good for her.
Yeah, I'm putting that on my watch list.
Not mentioned about paganism as well is that paganism celebrates the feminine, celebrates the sacred feminine, and absolutely does not have any kind of taboos or restrictions about women taking a leading role in their religions as well. So if you look at the Abrahamic religions, quite the opposite. We've got our popes, and we've got our archbishops, and we've got all these sort of like horrible bearded gentlemen, sorry, unshaved. But in witchcraft and in Druidism as well, and these various sort of neo-pagan religions, it's absolutely women are been equal from the very beginnings of them.
The goddess is a very key part of witchcraft and paganism as a figure, isn't she?
Goddesses,
celebrated, or goddesses,
you'll find some great stuff from Ronald Hutton if you're ever interested. And it's always worth listening to anything or that Professor Ronald Hutton says or writes or anything.
That Rod Hutton, you said, Mark. I'm just going to pop it in the chat.
Ronald. Yes.
Find
Okay.
a pen that works.
Pagan Professor of Divinity at Gresham College.
Okay. I'll check that out. Based on everything we've discussed then, I'm beginning to think, do we even need to use the term reclaim in this context? Do you think we should be reclaiming it?
I would hesitate to reuse the word, replace the word reclaim with reframe.
Okay.
Because I think that would be a more useful position to take for me as a writer, I think.
Sarah?
It's really tricky because there has been so much ill done to so many communities in terms of framing your beliefs as wrong and evil and bad. In the chat, the talk about voodoo or Santeria, and so many faiths of the African diaspora, that most, the First Nations people of most places have been demonized, and bad, evil, wrong. And so I think I don't have a better word, but reclaiming is useful in that, is reframing within reclaiming? I'm not sure. But, really owning what's gone before, acknowledging what has gone before is very clearly going, nope, not good enough. And then as people are doing more and more, being more nuanced, being more aware of the stories that they're using and being true to those stories, but honoring those stories better.
Someone's just said before we can reclaim, we need to claim first. What do you make of that?
Depends.
Put you on the spot.
Yeah, well, it would be easier to then sort of, if we had the moment to clarify what that meant, and then I could say yes, yay or nay. I feel that it is too broad to say absolutely 100% yes to that statement. But I no longer have the Satanic Panic is known for the bullshit that it is. There are positive things in popular culture, maybe sometimes a little upsetting, in that Wicca and witchcraft and everything's so squeaky clean. No, but yes, but no. It's great that things are getting better and that there is better storytelling about these things. Let it continue.
No. Mark?
I'm going to put a different in, which is just representation.
I like that.
It's a great although we also used reigniting because we were around doing fire festivals.
That one.
Bonfires. So the idea of it being, it's a living culture. I think that's the thing that's fascinating about it as a religion is not that that it's there are books of shadows and various things that are written by Gerald Gardner and various people at various times, but it's not a museum piece. There's a beautiful museum in Cornwall, as you've noticed, but it's not. The neo-pagan religions are not right. We're all going to do this exactly the same way as it's been done for all this time, and that's it.
Which is far too much like cats. Which is far too much like cats. If you try and organize them, they just won't. I'm trying to organize my fair share of them. Little organizations will splinter, change, evolve. People discuss. It's a thing that people are involved in rather than lectured to about. And it's as much about
lighting that fire and being around it and making it a real thing and being part of something natural and genuine. And sometimes you can if we can pull that into movies of all kinds, TV of all kinds, books of all kinds,
And books,
that's always be a good thing.
I just something popped into my head when you were talking about being around a fire. There's something for our international audience that we do every single year in England and sometimes Wales, Scotland, bonfire night, Guy Fawkes night, every 5th of November to celebrate Guy Fawkes who tried to blow up Parliament. That, would you say that has some paganistic elements to it?
No.
Simply
because it was done at a time that was deeply not pagan in the ways that we're talking about. I'm a big fan of Guy Fawkes, I have to say, in general. Lewis bonfire stuff, if you ever get to it, Lewis in the very south of England.
They walk around with flaming crosses on the streets.
It's awesome. There's just the whole thing is generally awesome. Guy Fawkes, only honest person to ever walk into Parliament. Great, this is brilliant mythic stuff. What is interesting with it though is if you look at who they were trying to kill, it was James VI and First. So James VI and First was has been the Scottish king, James VI, come to England after Elizabeth I. James VI and First wrote a book called Demonology. He was the one that led things like the North Berwick witch trials. He was deeply, he thought the witches had conspired to kill him. He thought the witches had sailed out on eggshells, admittedly, but we'll ignore that minor detail. He really did lead this idea of witches being this genuine force, and that the devil was there. They were led by the devil, and their covens met at sabbats, and that's really a huge part of where the witchcraft and Satan kind of comes from, is that very point in time. And you have Shakespeare. Shakespeare when he wrote Macbeth with the witches are awesome, and those witches are talking to Hecate, and I know pagans now that talk to Hecate. But that was Macbeth because there was a Scottish king arriving in London. That was pretty much a political thriller for him at that point. Quite different. But so Guy Fawkes and the gunpowder plot was a Catholic plot to kill a Protestant king. But it was what was happening at that time and the things that were around at that point. And how they impacted and how they influenced what people thought about witches and witchcraft has echoing still hundreds of years later.
Yep.
I think though, and please tell me, Mark, if I'm wrong on this. I feel like that the Guy Fawkes night has allowed us to tie on a whole load of stuff that maybe would sit better in Halloween. But Halloween is now candy and children going door to door and maybe carved pumpkins, mostly. But the bonfire, we love fires, we love warm things, apple bobbing, all that kind of stuff. You get to have that kind of in that festival-y kind of way for the 5th of November that maybe you don't get because maybe in your area you're not allowed to celebrate Halloween so much.
Yeah,
interesting.
I would definitely run with that. And I think bonfire night is much bigger in England than it is in Scotland.
Yeah,
it definitely happens, and we do like blowing things up. Any opportunity,
we all like that.
have things exploding and being. But there's also the reality of if you want to gather a bunch of people outside,
you need to be warm.
In Britain, it's really useful to have a bonfire. Otherwise, you're going to be please. And you can cook food on it as well, and you can do all these sort of like very civilized things. But
community-based things.
It's just not something that we do as much nowadays because we've got electric lights and because we're used to street lights and sitting on our porch with the lights burning and things. It's not obviously not completely vanished, but it's not something that's in everybody's experience the way it used to be. So it's enough just to turn all the electrics off.
Well, yes.
I've just remembered another example of a book where witchcraft is written in a kind of more positive light, and it was by Agatha Christie, and it's a lovely little novel called The Pale Horse, which is, I think, one of her only supernatural novels, and it's about a trio of witches who are very interesting characters, and that's a fantastic one, actually, because I mean Christie wrote everything from quite an intelligent perspective of people first, which also Daphne du Maurier kind of excelled at. But that's just popped to mind as another example of something that we could probably put under the pagan banner. I'm not sure, but
no, I mean, I think it fits the bill. I thank you for bringing it up, because I've read a lot of Christie, visited her house in the Devon as well recently, which was fascinating. But
it's lovely. What Greenaways?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely
nice
amazing. So if anyone,
one of her many houses.
Oh yeah, well, it's just one of the. Is she still the best-selling author of all time, or she's the best-selling author of all time. I think she's sold something like it's stupid millions of copies of books. But interestingly, that one wasn't one that sold particularly well, I think, because it wasn't a crime novel. It did veer into the supernatural at a time. I think it was out in the 50s, at a time where that wasn't really on vogue, and it was quite an interesting choice for her. It was an interesting choice for her to but it obviously was a story that stuck with her, and I've often wondered on the origins of that book with her kind of other catalogue of works. You should read her biography. It's quite interesting, because it does talk about that as well. We've got an interesting question, which is kind of related. Is paganism in fantasy literature and movies different than the paganism we see in horror?
I guess if it's made up, which fantasy often is, although fantasy novels, again, are also, and sci-fi, rooted in actual things, places, people, cultures. So that's a hard one to answer for me.
I think it's quite a blurred answer, is the way I'm thinking about it in my head. Sarah, Mark, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's usually treated quite differently, obviously because of the context of what you're doing, but usually they're going to be more sympathetic, I suspect, towards witches often in fantasy, because you have the wonderful, Morgan Le Fay and and Gandalf is their male equivalent, of wizards and witches, and the Harry Potters of the world, and Terry Pratchett's novels, obviously. They're very witch positive. You like those?
I agree.
And it's but that's not necessarily really reflecting what neo-pagan religion actually is, and what people actually do in their practices. It's often more the folk supernatural stories of witches and wizards and warlocks that kind of.
Well, it leans heavily into magic, doesn't it? We haven't spoken about magic yet, which is interesting.
Occultism.
Right, exactly. And the idea of actual, again, going back to practice. With fantasy, there's always a heavy element of some unnatural ability or some magical ability or some kind of power source or something, which is different with the horror genre. That it does exist. There is magic, there are supernatural things, but often horror also is focused on the human interaction between people, and that is the kind of source of tension or fear. And another example that springs to mind with sci-fi is Herbert's Dune with the Bene Gesserit. They're kind of a society, I suppose, of witches, but they have supernatural abilities. So do those imagined powers make it different? Or because our own folklore going back over the years also talks of magic, and Morgana Le Fay is a good example of that. Witches were often accused of turning into animals and shapeshifting, and the things like the Hair Lady, and so like magic is a really magic is a really interesting facet of this that we haven't really touched on yet, and I think that's where fantasy comes in for me as a genre, a literary genre, because that it often leads with that, you know.
Do you think supernatural and magic are this? I mean, I always struggle to square these in my head when I'm reading or writing, because supernatural and magic, to me, supernatural is always described more in a horror context, not so much in a fantasy context, and yet to me they're kind of they feel almost the same. Supernatural, extranatural, I can't explain it. Magic, I can't quite explain it. I know there are rules, but I'm not quite sure what the rules are.
With horror, the supernatural often encompasses, I guess, hauntings and ghostly activities and paranormal things as well. So you've got that extra element, which is a different conversation for a different panel. But I also sometimes call it hypernatural, because it often leans into kind of existing human qualities that are exaggerated for purposes of fiction, like having a sixth sense, or, you know. So the supernatural is a very, very broad spectrum of things, but I would posit that magic fits firmly in there for me as a writer, but I don't know what the exact definitions are.
So sorry, just to clarify, magic fits within supernatural rather than the other way around.
I would say so. I would say for me the supernatural concept, umbrella term, does that make sense? I don't know why I'm doing this.
Yeah.
This is not
No.
universal
It's
sign
rainbow.
language for an umbrella. Or a rainbow. Or a cave or something. You get the point.
I do.
Yeah, there. I was going to say, completely lost it now.
He's lost it.
Come on, I went that way.
We've been going quite a while. Don't worry.
No, it's all right. There'll be small hours here, so a bit like.
Yeah. For our listeners and viewers, Mark is calling. What time is it over there, Mark?
7:20 in the morning.
There we go. So
Yay.
Mark joined us very, very early in the morning.
It's been nice. I've been watching the dawn kind of slowly rising outside. It's very civilized. Yeah, magic. Although I was going to say, actually, and it's probably maybe a bit for Sarah as well. Magic is very much part of, for a lot of people, of the neo-pagan experience. They have wands. They own wands. You know, they have cauldrons. They cast spells. They work magic. They are using whatever it is that they're using to create change in the real world. That is the aim of what it is. I'm very interested to hear. I mean, it's far too personal probably for her to talk about that side of things. But is that the same as making a wish? Is that the same as saying prayer? People say a prayer, you know, and it's, you know, it's words and intention to reality.
Turning your will, putting your will to thoughts and intentions, manifestation. You know, those are all things that can be part of a pagan practice. I guess I haven't brought any of that up because it is so individual to the people. It depends on what your practice is. There are people whose practice leans very heavily into the occult. So it leans very heavily towards potion making and alchemy and all of those things. But then there's people like myself whose practice is much more animist and is about recognition of spirit in the world, in all things, even our computers.
Really? In our computers too?
Absolutely. So, you know, sometimes your computer will just have a mind of its own and you're like, what the hell, computer? Come on, let's commune. Let's have a chat about this and work it out.
They do have sprites and they do have trolls, and pixels are very closely related to pixies. So.
You heard it here first.
Pixies in Cornwall.
Absolutely. But yeah, it's the manifestation of will is, you know, ostensibly what magic is considered to be in the real world. And that manifests in so many different ways.
There's a fascinating surge of TikTok content around manifestations and spellcasting and tarot and all of the different, I suppose, individualistic. Yeah, it's you go on TikTok and spend any amount of time on there, and at some point you'll come across somebody teaching you how to cast a spell, or somebody drawing your cards for the day, or telling you that the man that you really fancy is thinking about you, or it's like there's a real, I don't know how much of it's tellering. I don't know how much of it's driven by people that actually know what they're talking about. How much of it's content farming. It's fascinating to me, this like almost, I guess I hate to use the word, but like new agey kind of movement that's now circling back around on social media. Yeah.
Someone has actually just said, wasn't there a thing a while back where a certain section of Witch Talk decided to curse the moon for some reason or another?
There we go. Witch Talk is a thing, is a definite hashtag.
I'm obviously looking at the wrong bits.
No, but like there's good and bad with anything, right? There's nothing wrong in my mind with that kind of stuff, because like, why the hell not? You know, you can post videos of people doing dumb challenges, like why not post, you know, it's just interesting to me how it like flourishes in different ways, right? So.
And I'm gonna finish. Sorry, Sarah, you were about to say something?
I was just something that shocked me to my core is that someone says that they were also cursing the fair folk, and I've just got to say that is the worst idea I've ever heard ever. Just don't do it. Don't mess with the fairies. Just don't.
You have been warned.
Don't. Respect, honor, etc., but just don't mess with the fairies.
Okay, we are almost out of time, but just time for one more question. Are there any original monsters out there anymore?
Wow, that's not a question, that's a sledgehammer.
I like to leave the best till last.
That's like another 7 hours. Come on.
You have 4 minutes.
Actually, a creature that comes to my mind is from Pan's Labyrinth, the creature with the eyes for hands.
Yes.
Does anyone know if that comes from a particular critter that we know of, or is it a cryptid in general, or?
That relates back to a comment I forgot to mention, where someone did say Pan's Labyrinth is a good example of humans as the baddies and pagans as the goodies. Yeah.
And the horror in that, the horror is absolutely committed by the people.
Yes, it really is. Appalling
things that are happening in there. And this magical world is a realm to escape to. It's a beautiful, absolutely beautiful film.
That crops up again with a fair number of World War II movies as well. That kind of supernatural element creeps in as a kind of method of escape. And didn't King write Dreamcatcher as well? Isn't that similar concept of? It's not a war setting, but it's a similar concept of people in an odd environment retreating into the kind of dreamscape, and with certain pagan overtones, I feel, particularly with the Dreamcatcher and stuff.
The film adaptation I actually thought was quite okay as well. Not as good as the book, but quite okay. I would recommend it for anyone who hasn't read or watched the film.
You saw nothing, sorry, rainbows.
It's okay, I'm used to being judged, it's fine. So.
No judgment here.
Except when there is.
Okay. In terms of monsters, I would hope there will always be new monsters, and they will, as most monsters do, have maybe some bits and pieces of inspiration from earlier monsters, but they're constantly shifting and constantly evolving. I'm sure, and I hope continue to do so for thousands of years.
And so say all of us.
Is a mythical creature just a cryptid with a promotional budget?
Final question.
Otherwise known as a successful novel.
And on that merry note, I'd like to thank our panelists, Mark Oxbrow, Sarah Johnson and Gemma Amor, for joining us tonight. If anyone is attending Bristol Con in the southwest of England this Saturday, the 29th of October, I believe Glasgow 2024 will have a fan table there. If I'm wrong, both Mark and myself will be there, and we will be busy promoting Glasgow 2024 to anyone who's interested in listening.
Well, I live in Bristol, so I have to come and see you now, don't I?
You do, yes. We also have some upcoming events in November. You can join us for Medieval Fantasy Food, Fact versus Fiction on the 10th of November at 9 p.m. That's GMT. And we've also got World Building and Magical Systems on the 23rd of November at 7 p.m. GMT. Please keep your eyes open on our socials for lots of exciting announcements, as we are now a seated con. It is coming to Glasgow in 2024. Hooray! And if you enjoyed this event, please come and consider volunteering for the convention as well. We're always looking for enthusiastic and cheerful people. Tell your friends, your family, force people to come and join us. That would be wonderful. And once again, thanks to our panelists for joining us tonight and engaging in such a really fascinating discussion. My thanks to all of you.
Thank you. If I can just say one thing in addition to what you were saying, John, if you have a look at the YouTube channel, there's almost all of our pre-existing video content that we've had talking about a vast array of subjects. So please do have a look, because there's lots of interesting things and interesting worlds to enter.
Thank you very much for reminding me. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you stay safe and have a really good rest of the week. And it's bye-bye from all of us.
Have a lovely Halloween, everybody.